So good morning, everyone. Hello. I think we can get started. By the way, we have some breakfast over there. Just feel free to grab croissant and coffee and tea. So welcome, and my name is Cyan and Chen. So we are curators of the Rippling exhibition, just the opposite, and also outside. If the lorry moves away, you will see the thing. So this symposium, Transversal Alliances, is an associated event of the exhibition. If you haven't seen it, feel free to go that way and outside. But today, we want to take the Rippling project as the point of departure to go outward to discuss more on the methodological and in terms of how the intersection of architecture, anthropology, performance, and filmmaking can be forged. So that's the point of today, and that's why throughout the program we have practices that we find really inspiring for our work, invite them here for the conversation. I guess maybe one small thing I will share is why architecture, anthropology, filmmaking, and performance. So personally, for me, the starting point of the Ripple project, that's about 10 years ago. I had the first visit to the village, Shan. And I was wandering on the streets and I got a little bit lost, and that's a very hot summer. And then a villager just saw me and invited me into her yard for a watermelon. And I sat really low on a tiny stool and I shared the watermelon with her. And that kind of bodily sensation, that specific way of sitting, meant something very special for me. But I wasn't able to grasp what it is because I was using the classic architectural documentation method approach to the village. And then it took me 8 years to find a way to capture that really what it means, that sitting low on the stool. And then that's only when the project opened up to anthropological method, to filmmaking, and to having performative improvisation with all the villagers. And then that little story is kind of why we are, like a footnote of why we are having this event today. So we are going to start. Cheng and myself trying to pack 10 years into 40 minutes, and we'll have a conversation with Ingrid and May. And then in the afternoon, we'll have a panel on the body and the performative, and then a panel on film and the ethnographic, and then architecture, film, and the curatorial. And at the end of the day, we'll wrap up with a roundtable discussion on transversal alliances. So, okay, we'll get started. And also, by the way, as you can see, it's really casual and easy. It's not like a lecture. We're trying to just have like enjoyable conversation for all of you. So feel free to interrupt. Okay, so we are sharing 3 stories today: pond, yard, Pinewoods. So let's start from this fieldwork encounter. So this is just one of the many random mundane road junctions in the Chinese countryside. And what you see this whitish hill, this was a lake. So now it's dried and becomes an open-air storage of construction aggregates. And the 2 roadsides is a plant nursery. So when trees here grow a little bit bigger in a few years, they will be moved to the city street, becoming part of the urban landscape. And then that's a year later, the same spot. So apparently that hill of construction aggregates is being used up, becoming buildings or infrastructure somewhere else. So let's think about this. At a national scale, this is a very tiny site of material extraction and processing. It's a tiny fragment of a supply chain, almost too mundane to be noticed. But however mundane, this is a faint trace of the material dependencies of urban life and a faint trace of how they transform territories out of sight. And not only material resources are extracted from rural areas flowing towards cities, so are labor forces. And China has 295 million rural migrant workers. They often work in construction and service industry in cities while having limited right to settle there. So they move back and forth between workplace in the city and their home village in the countryside, hence they have the name floating population. Just to contextualize the story we're going to share today, it focuses on the home village sites. So we've been working with Shigushan village for roughly 10 years. And the Shigushan, the thing about Shigushan is it's fairly ordinary. There's nothing special about it. It's just a typical rural site of both labor supply and resource extraction. And again, to contextualize a bit, Wuhan is Shigushan is located in Wuhan, and Wuhan is a key metropolis in central China with a population roughly around 30 million, so comparable to London. And Shigushan is at the outskirts, roughly 2 hours drive from the city center. So you get a sense of the relationship between that village and the city center. And most of the villages in Shigushan, they are or were part of the floating population. They are around 1,000 people in the official registration in the village, but in reality, there are only around 200 living there. So this emptying out phenomenon is the very feature common to more than 1 million villages in China. So ponds, yards, pine woods. These are fragments of life in Shigushan and also situated perspectives looking at the social and ecological dependencies of China's urbanization. And our way of working is process-oriented and interweaves architecture, anthropology, filmmaking, and performance. And this structure here is an open-ended assemblage. It's not a logical machine, and it does not offer an all-encompassing narrative. So we will share 3 stories, but also alluding to the so much more out there. And the 10-year process is as much about the subject as it is about the methodology. Because the life words of rural migrant workers are in a perpetually indeterminate state, and this requires methods that are attuned to such characteristics. So ultimately, we find our practice and their way of life are intertwined. Start with pound. And this is the pound. And this is a post-harvesting fish pound. So fish harvesting is actually quite a tough job. Get up at 3 in the morning and catch fish in the freezing cold. And this is how the fish can reach the modern markets on time. And the fish pound is on the mountaintop of Shigushan. This village name, Shigushan in Chinese, actually means stone bone mountain. So the fish pond here are in fact part of the formal stone extraction site during the nationwide collectivization known as the People's Commune. In one sentence, the People's Commune was an all-encompassing political, economic, social, and spatial model to enact an explicit socialist ideal in China between 50s and 80s. So the commune radically remade land and people's lives. In the 70s, here in the Shigushan, hills were flattened and stones extracted from the mountaintop made 13 rows of commune housing. And then these housing are still standing and are partially in use. A lot of things can be said about commune, but I'm just gonna mention one particular dimension. So the housing design. Housing design was an essential device of the state to dismantle the family as the unit of production, governance, and social structure. So in the ideal commune housing, it was to abolish living room and kitchen so that living units were reduced to a combination of bedrooms And in this way, it meant there's no space for family sharing or food sharing. Then it meant to weaken the patriarchal authority. But in Shigushan, the realized people's commune housing shows a much more nuanced reality than the commune ideal. So what appears we see here as standardized housing role is in fact made up of differentiated housing units based on different family structures. Here we see how the family structure works. So according to the village leader of the time, these variations actually took into account the age of children, their sex, the number of generations sharing the units. So all this means that the housing was still, to an extent, defined by the family and its size. So the Shigushan housing design actually mediated, in spatial terms, the tension between the modern state and the family structure. And that's the most common setting in the living room you can find in rural China in general, actually, is that family shrine to Mao. Mao is the founder of PI China, who initiated the commune movement instead of a family shrine to family ancestors. So this is a paradox. It's the paradox that the commune, in fact, resembled and renewed the traditional social spatial structure that is set out to destruct. The commune system was abolished in the 1980s, but this family shrine to Mao are rural realities today. So these two opposing forces, the commune institution and the family tradition, they are ultimately intertwined, and they're both constitutive to rural realities today. So let's get back to the mountaintop. This kind of brutal vertical section we're looking at now, it shows the extent of the stone extraction. And on this mountaintop, in the parts where the stone extraction stopped, some villagers start to nourish the dry land on the mountaintop, cultivating new lives by turning big extraction holes into fish pond. That's what you're looking at. So this act is both caring for the land, but also for personal financial gains. And these extraction sites, they are scarred landscapes carrying a radical political history. And the fish ponds are forms of opportunistic reparation of the scarred landscape. Just like what we see in the implemented commune housing, it's a mix of obedience, resistance, and agency. And a fish pond like this came into being is also, again, a tiny spot of reality of China's economic reform, starting from the 1980s, that replaced the commune system. Because cultivating fish pond for personal profits was not imaginable under the commune system. And activities like this are made possible by the new household responsibility system of production and land management in rural China. But of course, the story doesn't end here. The ethos of the economic reform let some people get rich first. It states in plain words the justification for territorial hierarchy and the assumption of the trickle-down effects of economy. So from city to district to town, then to village. So this sequence from city to district to town to village. The territorial hierarchy leaves the countryside in an end-of-line condition, with small towns and villages forming satellites of satellites. It's a systematic setup that exploits rural areas in the name of long-term national economic development. So as a result, the meaning and the value of the countryside is always framed through the city, and its own identity and autonomy are long lost. And over time, this constitutes an act of symbolic violence. And in very concrete terms, this has led to the intensified resource extraction for urbanization. And what has also been drawn into the supply chain is rural labor. So the outflow of labor from countryside, that 295 million rural migrant workers, have resulted in the middle generation missing from more than 80% of rural families in China. So the grandparents of young children are left behind in the village, economically dependent on the middle generation working in the city. So come back to this overview. Here, I hope to get the point through is territory is really a machine where political and economic forces push and pull the flows of materials and labor. And the stories of the rural migrant workers and the territorial apparatus, they come together in these travel routes between Wuhan city center and Shigushan village. Because this travel route cuts across the territorial structure, that's the structure in which the village is situated, the structure in which the rural families operate, and the structure in which the spatial, administrative, and economic organizations correlate. So let's get on this journey. We're starting from a construction site in central Wuhan, and we are traveling across now the Yangtze River. And then we are going to the industrial zone at the outskirts, and then the suburban districts, and then rural towns, and we will later arrive at Shigushan village. As we travel, a note to say that this is a double journey. So it's a personal journey that I went on dozens of times for field work, but also for villagers in Shigushan, that's the journey they take to make a living. So now we are going to enter Shigushan very soon. So that part, like between Wuhan and here, so partially what comes in the journey, what does not, is partially informed by the villagers' experiences based on conversations, like they're telling me the construction site they worked at, or the port they worked at, or the highway or station that bring them home. But it also, this kind of depiction comes from my own architectural training in understanding the territorial organization. So this journey is kind of a conversation in that sense. And back in the village, actually, a considerable amount of rural migrant workers return to their village when they retire from jobs in the city. So their adult children then take their turn to leave the village. So the returned generation take care of their grandchildren. So in this way, floating and dissolving come full circle. And here again, if you still remember that lady with the construction worker we met at the beginning of the journey. So now we're at her home. Right, so look at this as a whole. I want to take a moment to talk about school as method. So I guess it's sort of apparent that I learned this compositional logic from the traditional Chinese landscape painting. So here what is emphasized is the experience of the territory rather than the view of it. So there's no start, no climax, no end, no single center, and no single viewpoint. So it is about creating layers and layers of juxtaposed conditions in continuity. So one leading to another, then beyond. So then in this way, there are dimensions of time and movement weaved into it. So the drawing is still, but I would say it's a still moving image. Another key principle is juxtaposition. So juxtaposition here means that parts come before the whole. So each part or component actually opens up a micro lens into the abundance of life situated in each territorial fragment. And since the school was also developed as a tool for design research, so it's a combination of what is there and what could be there. And altogether, in slightly fancier terms, I call it a hosting device of ethno-fictional documentation and grounded speculation. I guess maybe you already felt that just now watching the journey. The score is somewhat patchy, and it could indeed be a little bit disorienting. But think of it, if this is not how one experiences a territory, and even if this is not how one experiences life in general. So ultimately, all these patchy fragments come together and constitute the whole, while being held loosely in relation to one another. And this is the principle of structured ambiguity. And this is also how stories of rippling are held together. And with the school, we arrived at the home village of the floating journey. And there we go, that's the home village. So what happens here makes possible the labor supply of rural migrant workers, which then makes possible China's urbanization. So the missing middle generation, they often send a large portion of their earnings back home to sustain the livelihoods of family members in the village, and also to fund the construction of new family houses. That's the houses we're looking at. So this area view is an acute irony, because there are fewer people living in the village, but there are more and more self-built family houses that stand half vacant. So this construction is both the desire and the predicament of rural migrant workers. And these self-built houses in the field of architecture are generally considered as a threat to the beauty of the countryside. But I would say it is this ordinary house that embody the contemporary reality and actually manifest a fundamentally different way of understanding family and domesticity. So let's look at one example. It's a self-built house where two brothers' family live together up there. So what we can see from this plan is the various demands for independence and sharing among family branches and generations. So even though the two brothers' family, they live in the same three-storage building, they have identical yet separate entrances, living rooms, and staircases. And even though half of the room in the main building are vacant, the parents still choose to live in adapted old schoolrooms across the street. But they share the kitchen garden area with a laboring family. So again, what holds all these elements together are the yards, where all three parties of the household and the neighbor share kitchens, toilets, and kitchen garden. So that's their yard, and this is the yard I was invited to on my first visit. So the configuration of this yard and all the daily objects is telling us something. It's telling us that this is a space for association and negotiation. On the one hand, cooking, eating, governing, and the care of children and the elderly are shared and joint responsibilities, which largely defines the daily life of these families. While on the other, there's also a sense of separation, reminding that all of this takes place in delicate forms of collaboration within the extended families between generations, genders, and households. So therefore, the yard provides a spatial structure through which domestic labor and subsistence production are organized. So in other words, the yard mediates family relations. And now let's meet Liu family. And this is Xu, the lady who shared with me the watermelon. And we met her in the school journey as well.
这3个我又泡汤一下，我来放假，你说帮我，爱放假嘛，别你么走，老两么不分的，他泡汤一些不用牛吃了。
我是对吧？
我一个我就
他我里面老的
Just to note, this is a short excerpt of our film On the Margins, and we have the full film trilogy screening in the gallery. Just a couple of notes. What we read from this, what we call architectural reconstruction of filming space and time. So that's the missing middle generation. It's kind of life around Liu family, but we will never meet Liu here. So the missing middle generation results in the increased intergenerational and cross-household dependency on extended family members. But this is not a return to the tradition, because the absence of the middle generation, particularly men and thus fathers, is actually shaking the traditional family structure to its core. So then the idea of family here is no longer that of a homogeneous, well-defined and close unit, but rather a dissolved one. And its complexity interweaves 3 layers: the traditional social cultural roots of family in China, and second, a recent history of China's national collectivization, which was the People's Commune we talked about. And then thirdly, is the contemporary reappropriation and reinvention of familiar forms. So then what is dissolved family? It's a support network. A support network different from the modern nuclear family. It's a support network underpinned by the associational relationship in rural society. And with that notion in mind, if we look at the village scale, it almost becomes evident that all the family yard, they constitute a communal structure. Because this family yard, they create a series of elastic penetrable zones around the houses, allowing for multiple layers of subtle relationships between the household and the village. And actually with collaboration initiated within a family, evolving into a mode of local collaboration, particularly about agricultural production, that start to work beyond family relations, the dissolved families may become a new form of social structure. And as we kind of flying out from the village settlements, there are patches of pine woods around the village. And then we move on to Pinewoods.
So under the current collective land ownership of rural areas, each household has a right to own a parcel of land in the village for farming or planting, in addition to a house site. And the pine trees requires rather low maintenance. Because of this, an important group of Pinewoods caretakers are elderly women. Most of them are widowed and live alone for a very long time. And we call them grannies. That is a local term of respect and affection. Grannies collect oil-rich pine needles for cooking. It's free and can help reduce the fire risk of the woods in very hot and dry seasons. And also because of being oil-rich, sap harvesting is a way for elderly caretakers to generate additional small income without much physical work from themselves. When larger incomes are needed, pine trees can be sold to the nearby factories. So from there, the pine woods become veneer, then become plywood, going into the construction industry or furniture making. Through timber product, grannies who are no longer part of the floating population are still entangled in the material flows between the countryside and the city. For grannies like them, their pine woods are a form of basic economic security. The state pension provision in China, despite covering a wide range of the population, is far from enough to provide a safety financial net for them. But this form of forest-based security is rather fragile. We witnessed pine woods being destroyed by accidental fires, by very heavy snow in winter, and most recently by the expansion of Wuhan's new 6th ring road. So some of the grannies, they live in a corner space attached to the main house, despite the house remaining empty most of the time. So this plan shows a scenario where Granny Luan, and she lives at the very back of her two sons' houses in the area highlighted in gray. The grannies live in marginalized spaces in a marginalized village community. This double marginalization renders them invisible. Even the language they use in daily life is saturated with symbolic violence, such as they always refer themselves as being old and dirty. So in the context of all this, they form their own support networks through the most mundane activities. In their life roles, domesticity is rather a field idea. The domestic domain is not confined to the building, but extends to its immediate contacts. Boundaries of these domains are hardly marked by walls, but rather by daily objects placed around it and by activities. Family houses are like pebbles dropped in water, and the spreading ripple are their realms of domesticity, which may change depending on the subject and time. This is what we call the ripple effect of domesticity. The distinction between the domestic and the public is constantly diffused by the everyday practices of the rural families, both through their use of space and through the subjectivities that persists in their rural way of life. The practice of rippling defies the confinement and codification of domesticity. So here's another case. Guanyi Cai has been living alone for more than 30 years, so she's now hiding in the room, in the shadow. So she keeps lots of different chairs and stools herself for other living alone grannies who pay her a visit in afternoons, and they often gather for small chats around them. So this kind of little gathering is socially significant in the village. The bonds forged between widowed elderly women begin to disrupt the usual family lineage that dominates social activities in the village. And the chairs waiting under this autumn sun are cracks in the patriarchal dominance. So taking a stool out and sit at a threshold is a very, very common scene in the village. Seemingly, they're just sitting there doing nothing, but this is in fact active waiting. By pushing their own bodies to inhabit thresholds on a collective scale, these villagers are actively building up an elastic field of support and a sense of relatedness between them. This is to reconfirm social bonds beyond family, which is crucial at a time when state welfare is insufficient and core family members are absent. Active waiting is an example of the non-discursive. If we ask the villagers why they're sitting there, there will be no answer from them. They just do it. Things like active waiting are very bodily, almost a disposition, something that cannot be crystallized, but very important for holding the support network together. So back to the Pinewoods story, the other main group is caretakers are middle-aged women who float most frequently between the city and the rural countryside. And we call them aunties. So their high mobility is because they provide much caregiving labor to the family, such as looking after the newborn when needed. And the low maintenance of Pinewoods become an ideal option for their land at home. So the high mobility of aunties result in the increased planting of pinewoods in the village. Here, a socio-economic condition of rural migrant workers become an ecological condition of the village landscape. When aunties float, they tend to go in small groups with relatives and friends. And this is another type of rippling. When they are in the village, the aunties like to dance by the street after dinner. This is one of the very rare moments in which they can be just themselves without any family duties or away from work. There is a very profound sense of liberation in their movement, and there is beauty even in the most precarious livelihood. The state of rippling and dissolving is an elastic form of association, through which the act of mediating between genders, generations, households, neighbors, and the village community is constantly framed and even spread to the city through floating. Crucially, dissolving the family is a temporary, transient state that has become part of a broader structure rather than an exception. These families form indeterminate and resilient assemblages at the edge of the capitalist apparatus, both within and outside, that stretch spatially from house to territory, coordinate temporarily from daily to multi-year cycles, and manifest as bodily disposition in everyday life. So domesticity as such is untamed.
So we have a short pause here, because arriving at this conceptual proposition of untamed domesticity could be a conclusion of research, and I somehow did have a PhD that concludes this way. There's a but. But the longer I work with the village community, the more acutely I felt that I cannot stop here. So back to the score. What I was trying in the score was to use design scenario to grasp that practice of rippling. So design here is definitely not to provide solutions of any sort, but rather as a contribution to the research framed by questions of design. So simply, it just allows me to activate that speculative mode of thinking in order to crystallize the practices of rural families into a series of spatial conditions. So when spatial conditions are coupled with all the life there is to be observed, produced, and imagined through them, a scenario is constituted. So design scenario here becomes an embodied abstraction of the ethnographic observation and spatial analysis. Then through scenarios, the familiar is made strange and the strange familiar. So key characteristics of dissolving and rippling are extracted and then amplified in order to constitute a spatial definition from within. So again, look at this school in entirety. It is just one single drawing that blends and condenses ethnographic documentation and speculation grounded in the specificities of lived experiences through constructing layers and layers of juxtaposed conditions in continuity. However, limitation of the school lie in its accessibility. It is first and foremost a tool to facilitate scholarly interpretation and proposition with inevitable reduction, and its making is devoid of direct participation of the villagers. So if the project is really concerned with how rural migrant workers make worlds, then what I'm grappling with is who tells the story and whose voice is this? And that prompts a new phase of the project, and I'll hand over.
So this new phase, we're mainly exploring this idea of co-curation with the villagers. And during our work stay in the village, the daily activities were about improvising together with the villagers in slightly odd scenarios. So for us, improvisation means creating conditions in which villagers can become active agents in co-curation, rather than us as trained architect, anthropologist, or choreographer parachuting into the village to study their locals. For example, we prompt the group of aunties to dance in the People's Commune Assembly Hall. Post-commune, the building was abandoned and even being used as a pigeon farm for about a decade. So this group of aunties never danced in the commune hall before, as this place relates so much to their childhood memory with very heavy loaded political events. But nevertheless, they were quite excited to give it a go. So the very loud music during their dance rehearsal attract nearby villagers to walk into the commune hall, and children just came in with their bikes. Elderly came too, and some of them have never returned to the commune hall since the closure in about 1980s. So the place was completely transformed in that one afternoon. Our approach is fundamentally process-oriented. Villagers are not sources of qualitative data for subsequent interpretation. They are also not abstract research subjects whose diverse experiences are often too easily reduced to either victim or hero narratives. They're just real people that we're trying to connect with. So another example, what we suggested was to take a family portrait with Granny Jiang, who has been living alone for a couple of years with all this, and during the time when we visit her, she has this 20-something pumpkins scattered around in the house. So when we mentioned a family portrait, we just pull out all the pumpkins. So that becomes her family members, and she picked her favorite one, holding it on hand. So feeling slightly odd or weird is the delicate, ambiguous state that we're trying to co-curate with them. Between the familiar and the strange, it is one step out of reality, but not entirely into fiction. With improvisation, we hope to stimulate the villagers' own performative expressions, modes of storytelling, and imagination that are otherwise hidden. In the summer of 2023, we organized a screenback event in the village through a film installation in the abandoned commune hall where the aunties were dancing there before. We shared with the community how their beautiful daily life and their situated imaginaries are featured on screen. Our film installation turned the commune hall from a political site into a theater of everyday life. Almost the entire village came, and they all loved it. So among all recognitions, this is the most significant to us. And based on this experience, we turned that into a short film, which is screening in the gallery room called The Hall. So all of these are our attempts to join the marginalized communities in their situated perspectives and embodied vision. Also in this process, we start to understand what it means to be with others. Being with is a practice that really requires time, attention, trust, and openness. Sometimes it requires the active unlearning of familiar ways to open up senses. Then through back and forth exchanges, a connection might be forged. Singing, listening, dancing, recording, filmmaking, if done with care and sensitivity, it could be an act of solidarity. So from participant observation to performative improvisation to collective happening, this project is a long-term commitment to a place, its marginalized community and their agency, complicity and resistance, all rooted in precarity. At the end, the project hopes to prompt a sense of curiosity and courage to ground ourselves in the complex, messy realities of life, to confront the fractured, disjunctive conditions of all our existences, and to affirm how one's life is intricately connected to another. That's the end of the presentation.
And now can we have Ingrid and May come to join us on the table. So brief introduction. Well, Ingrid is the director of the AA, probably without introduction. And May is professor of cinematic arts from Westminster, where she also co-directs the CREAM Center for Research and Education in Arts and Media. Take your seats wherever you want. I'll do a more proper introduction when it comes to your panel in the afternoon. And for now, let's...
Wonderful. I'm never quite sure how close these things need to be. That was fantastic. I mean, I'd love to hand to you, May, because obviously the way in which your work has been captured contains such a fascinating scope within the scale, within the understanding of time, both contained within the scroll and within the filmmaking. And I'm curious, because obviously we haven't had a discussion yet, and we've had many discussions, you and I, Chen and Cyan and myself, over the last year, about the ambitions of the project and where it might move forward. But this idea of how you start to capture anthropological thinking that still has a speculative and provocative nature, that isn't just trapped in observation, through the medium of film, I think is a fascinating thing to hear from you, May, about your impressions of the work.
So maybe let's try starting where you left off. Questions of methods and experimentation with experimentation as part of speculative praxis, and therefore experimentation with methods interests me very, very much. And I was very, very struck in your storytelling. The figures of the aunties and the grannies are, of course, very, very key. The way that you yourselves call these women aunties and grannies are very, very key. And one of the things that I find myself thinking about a lot is the question of improvisation as also improvisation of kinship. And therefore, that is possibly one of the ways that we can think about your own improvisation around this method of being with. And what really interests me here is the way that maybe you yourselves improvise, appropriate, or even possibly turn inside out in rather interesting ways, the legacies, residues, and structures of kinship that are there to be invented and reinvented and taken up, because this way of doing feels to me very close to home and highly recognizable to my various sort of activities that I do, which I sometimes call field play. Curation is playing around, and to me, the way in which one enters a space which is other to me, quite a lot of it is around what are the structures of kinship that I find myself, maybe despite of myself, taking up.
Yeah, I think this notion of field play, that's, I think, precisely Ingrid's point, like how to have that delicate balance between participant observation and speculation, right? I guess you just answer it with your own method of field play. And that formation, improvisation of kinship, that's so beautifully said. And it's the first time I heard it. I think, yes, it's true. It's like, because actually, we were just told in the process of making this exhibition that granny, this term, is considered not so polite in the British context. And we have to explain ourselves why we call them grannies, because it might consider a bit offensive. But for us, it's literally, because for them, that's part of the symbolic violence, is that they think, especially younger generations, no one wants to get closer to them. And then us calling them grannies is to referring to them as part of the family, referring to them through a familiar relation. And in that way, granny is actually a term of respect and affection. And I guess that's exactly what you are talking about, this improvisation of kinship. And also, I guess, to expand on this point, it's about like kinship beyond the bloodline, in a way. That's also like, if we're talking about kinship, then what about the Pinewoods? Let's say we have pumpkins already in the granny's home, and then what about Pinewoods? Because the relationship between Pinewoods and grannies is they depend on each other. And even the fragility is what they share. The grannies are fragile, and then the pinewood is fragile. And then the pinewood is a form of social security for the grannies. And then if you think about that even a bit more expandively, then there are other creatures and also human actions involved in it. So then in this rural way of life, then all the things come in this circle. It's like all the things take their turns to share this kinship, to share this moment on earth in a way, if we can say a bit more. And that's actually our third film we just finished last week, about this, taking your term, this improvised kinship or expanded kinship, to inject the sense of speculation into observation, but it is not fiction, let's say.
I suppose also you have this question of, the value of narrative in design practice and the value of narrative in anthropological practice. The problem we often have when we think speculatively within the social sciences is one of causality. And therefore, where do you leave off the observation and then start to structure the understanding of that observation? I think that the two or three things that I found really fascinating. One is the combination of the drawing and the film, and then the juxtaposition of the multiple films, so the paired film footage, and then also when that becomes like a section through space. So by taking those observations and then pairing them or tripling them, you're making an inference of comparison. And I'm wondering if that was one way in which you're overcoming the relationship between the observational and the speculative through the structure of the presentation of the film?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think we started from a quite more conventional way of doing this documentary, of recording the daily lives. And then because we're so fascinated the kind of fluidity between spaces as architects, but we struggled how to capture that. But through the architectural training, we know lots of ways to draw it or to talk about it, but how to actually capture in a filmic space. So actually borrow the collage techniques from architecture to do the same collage in film, which turns out to be quite an interesting way of doing it. A lot of these shots is impossible to shot because it's the threshold, how can you place your camera? But I think it's by doing that and also this seeing the inside and outside, there's always a very interesting interactions between the two, like people just shouting from here and there, and the geese and chicken just running around with kids. I think the film provides a new way of capturing it in a kind of very live with texture. So we find that very, really interesting and something we really, really want to explore more. Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of interesting to me the way that in each of the series of films, at what point do you maybe try to see the space as, even if it's a portion of space you're wanting to see, you're trying to sort of present it as a whole? And at what point you let yourselves go really close? And what are the impulses there? And I guess sort of underlying this is my curiosity about how you place yourselves within the ripples and the flows and the patterns and the textures of the everyday there. Not entirely as researchers and observers, but what if I was to just sort of, coming back to the question of how you invented some kind of a kinship moment that meant that you had a place and an intimacy with the people, the ecology, and the objects in the village at that point. So therefore, I think here we can think in terms of tensions, paradoxes, struggles, and emotions that maybe we catch traces of in the form of presentation that you give us here, and that maybe it's something that is there irrespective of what you tell us as well. This is what interests me a lot, because I feel the push and pull, maybe between the researcher and the observer and something else, which maybe you don't fully tell us about, but I'm curious about what you don't fully tell us about.
Can I add to that question? Because you start the conversation around, 10 years ago, or however long, that you came and you were lost. and there's a point between 10 years ago and now that there's a question of familiarity. At what point, to what extent do you retain your status as a visitor or a stranger?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So maybe I'll just literally review the 10-year process. So my relationship with the village, actually, the local university who supported this whole research, Huazhong University of Science and Technology, even before I came to the village, they already have a relationship with the village, and I graduated from that university. So I inherited a bit of that relationship already the first time I went there. And then it takes the form of AA visiting school. So we ran the visiting school with Sam Jacoby for 2 years. And that, our relationship with the village is a weird wonder during summertime, because they remember there are 2 big cars of students coming from somewhere and then somehow embracing their life. And then this research took the turn of, it's a project called Collective Forms in China, funded by British Academy. And then that is a very rigorous academic research into that. I guess that's my turning point, because on that point, if you bring the research really into the rigor of social science, and on that point, I feel like things are being miffed out. And then so the stage, so it's actually like it's going even more into the classic academic research. And then that point is kind of like a breaking point. And then after that, what we did is literally simply let go the whatever structure and objectives and just go there and then live with them and stay there. And that's how I guess our roles really, really changed. And at the beginning, like literally we had the objectives. When you write for the application, they're always objectives. You need to do this and that. And then we realized whatever we planned, it never happened. So at the end, if to really let go whatever we had in mind and then to turn ourselves into the local way of life, which is just go with them or them go with us. And then I think from there, the relationship start to change. And only from that point, we pick up camera. Because before, we thought it might be a bit too much. But then after they get really, really familiar with us, comfortable with us, they do whatever they do with or without us. And then that's the point. We move on to the different stage.
So I guess the key word here is improvisation and how that came to you. How can we use this project to think interestingly or do interestingly around improvisation, I wonder, beyond the specificity of this project? Is what I'm now thinking about.
Also, does that depend on the reception of the work that you produce? I mean, I'm interested that you also, you show these films to the community and they have the opportunity to watch themselves, which ultimately is also a form of improvisation, in that it's affecting, even just temporarily, their reading of their own lives. Even if simply, there's always a fascination sort of seeing yourself on screen, pointing at your friends. But that creates a dynamic that is, actually quite unique, that won't be experienced again or before either. And I'm wondering if that then has a response in your own work that could be considered a form of improvisation.
Yeah, I think 2 points together is kind of pointing to the act of intervention in a way in this whole work. Because by showing the film back to them in that abandoned commune hall, it is intervention. That's also, I guess, is what you're alluding to on improvisation. Also, you mentioned earlier on the speculative end of it. I guess, like, literally for them, I guess the most striking new way of looking at the image, looking at the village, looking at their own life is actually the drone footage. Because they recognize everything from the ground, and then they know that by heart. But to see the village for the first time from the sky, that's something quite new for them. How has that changed our work?
I think the key for me, the improvisation, is really about allowing for openness of this undefined result. I think the whole process of doing improvisation in the village really kind of enhanced this belief that with a good, it's like a faith, you just trust in it and it will happen, but you don't know what it will be. But I think it's quite difficult to shift that kind of mindset of allowing these unplanned things to happen and see how it goes, which we sort of carried over to the next project on tracing sand, because when we are traveling along the Mekong River, there is also a lot of uncertainty of whoever we're meeting with, what happened next day. But it's kind of to embrace this sort of openness. I think that gives a path to new possibilities. I guess it's quite difficult to really describe how that feels, but I think it's more sort of like a mental change for us in terms of the way we work from the Shigoshan project.
It's so interesting because I really feel that as designers, the ethnographic process is kind of really irritating. In that stepping back and allowing it to happen, allowing it to be observed, maintaining a level of distance, not trying to make some sort of grand narrative. Because of course my instinct is always to build this into a wider understanding of kind of global processes of material extraction. And I spoke last night a little bit about, the delight in design and the kinds of work also that you're doing is that it humanizes things that are otherwise only catastrophic and only planetary. And that there are kind of wonderful accidents is something that is a continuous process of discovery, which I think is really wonderful. Of course, my mind is then also going to the fact that, somehow those improvised kinships is then making a sort of mirror of processes of urbanization where kinship structures are inevitably undermined and therefore create degrees of new freedom and new models. But I'm over-intellectualizing something that is actually quite beautiful in perhaps its more simple form, in its perhaps unoverly analyzed state, in that then there's continuous modes of discovery of the things that you haven't yet found, rather than the predetermined nature of design of traditional research processes. And I hope you can hang on to that as you continue with the SAND project, because it's quite hard to not have a sort of foregone conclusion in the observations that you make. I don't know if the processes with which you work enable you to kind of keep yourself back from making those conclusions too fast.
Yeah. I think before joining the Ripple project, I had a lot of like designer egos in everywhere. It's like you really sort of join in millimeter accuracy and trying to build everything as planned, and you cannot allow anything accident to happen, and you would just freak out on the side and don't know what to do. But I think through the years of transformation in the village, I managed to do this drivestone foundation, which I can't really imagine to do it from 5 years ago. Because this is an organic material, and you cannot draw it or say, just chop it to that. You cannot define it, and you have to work with it. You have to work with the site condition. But how can you reach to a stage allowing that flexibility and openness and knowing how to deal with it without a controlled design documents? I think that's quite an important lesson for us from the field work, weirdly, back to the design process. But I think it's the same for the filmmaking, for the way we think, for the way we do research. I think that beauty of improvisation, it grows a seed from there.
Just a bit add on that. I think you're totally so spot on, I guess, the key features we kind of arrived at this moment. It's about allowing for gaps, openness, and contradictions, but without falling apart. There's still a thing. So Cheng just explained through the design process. I guess for me personally, it's literally, I reached that conclusion of untamed domesticity at the end of my PhD, and then the school drawing. It took me 3.5 years to do that. It takes me longer to unlearn that, because I reached that conclusion. I have that school drawing, and then the time afterwards, it's all the effort to undo what I learned as a trained researcher and scholar, and then that's also what this village have done to me. Telling me, like, forget about the intellectual talking and all of that, just be a person in that moment with them. I guess this is kind of what I learned from the fieldwork personally, and also this is exactly the principle that we're bringing forward in the SAND research.
I mean, walking through your exhibition and encountering the scroll is a really interesting, and maybe sort of, I had ambivalent feelings. And then I keep thinking that the little that I know about the scroll format in Chinese art history, that what's interesting about the scroll is not just the sort of the question of duration in terms of temporal indeterminacy, but that what the scroll brings is this cosmological dimension of scales and dimensions of worlds, shifting a lot. And I wanted to know what becomes of that in your usage of the scroll in order to render the, I suppose, the architectural and the temporal quality cycles of life and interrelation in this village. I wanted to know where is the suggestion of everyday existence as living with the unknown, with quite a lot of the unknown, as powerless people, in the choice to use the scroll format. You know, what becomes of, perhaps we can call it, the more cosmological dimension of existing.
I guess for the score, one thing it appears to me that it can take different forms, like what in the exhibition is the linear form that invites audience to walk around it. So the movement suggested in the score, it actually should show, it takes kind of its form in audience walking around them. But that motion is embedded in drawing the score itself. I guess the point you're asking, I guess, is a different form of score for me, is the concertina form. When the score becomes a book, it's folded into that. And then in that, it's that whole journey, but there's no, you can open at any point. And you can just look at that. And then I guess that's the kind of sense is closer to what you're alluding to just now. But also, again, for me, as a still trained architectural designer, that's the change of scale is a thing for me special. What the school allows me to do, because from the beginning it's more like the documentation. At the end, when we go into people's homes in that school, it becomes that's actually the design. That's the design scenario I was talking about. And then that design scenario reflects how I see the social and spatial structure of their life, but not manifested in the existing houses. So that's what I called through the design scenario. It becomes a spatial definition of reality from within. And then this only happens because of the change of scale is allowed in this kind of score format. Also, that move from documentation to speculation is also, maybe it's easier to talk like this. It's indicated by this rapid change of scale in the middle of it. This is the bit that's actually entering the Shigushan village. And then up there, I had all these buildings at different scale. It's like a quick zoom in, or you can say it's like a leap forward into the future as a way to suggest that what comes next, it's kind of the speculative part of the spatial definition of reality. As this is kind of more like the thinking of take the school as a tool for design research, I suppose.
So, as someone who has totally ignorant about fields of design and architecture, so now I'm wondering currently what are these disciplines fretting over, worrying about around the question of how to see? And is the tension here, this effort to see in relative totality in order to explain something versus a condition of the world where actually living with the unknown is very present in many spheres and scales of life. And living with massive unknowns mean we cannot see like that. Not even worth trying. So how do we see?
Excellent points. I think, I just speak for myself. The architectural training, I guess, is a very, very scary sense for an architect to think that cannot capture the overall picture. I guess, because the architectural training gives me the systematic way to think, to synthesize things. That's, I think, is one of the most valuable parts of architectural training. And then also exactly as you said, it's the world is patchy, the world is fragmented, and the overall picture is inevitably constructed. So I guess that's the way I'm trying to address it. In this particular medium, if to allowing the part that come before the whole. I guess that's kind of the principle I was explaining here as in juxtaposition. Because usually if you do that kind of territorial drawing, it's kind of subject to certain objectivity or to certain overview that needs to be captured. But in the school format, it allows just different fragments at different territorial structure stitched together like this. So if to holding these fragments together loosely, so that's kind of what I refer to as structured ambiguity.
But I'll stand up for architecture, I think. I mean, I don't think we're trying to picture a whole, actually. And I think the scroll is a way of talking about simultaneity. And I think that, if anything, the problem with architecture is, unless you're creating a series of instructions for building, in which case there's a necessity to describe as much as possible to enable a process to occur that then makes a thing that is in the world, that is its own whole, that gains its own narrative, that gains its own history. The rest of it is about assembling a series of fragments that express a set of ideas or a position or a drawing tradition that then has different value. And you never can describe the whole thing. It's the sort of fragments of a dream, as if, that you just woke up and tried to scribble down. And it never really gets towards what you're trying to describe. So therefore, you're always attempting to then say, oh, well, actually, there's a humanizing element. This is very much about the inhabitation of space or the sense of environment. Another may be borrowing from cartographic traditions and all of that, what that entails. Some of it may be having kind of radical adjustments of scale that create hierarchies that are not even there. And I think that there's a tremendous fictive aspect to most architectural expression until the thing lives in the world. And then it lives in the world in a very kind of imperfect way. I mean, if you speak to any architect, the worst thing is the completed project, because it's always sort of slightly terrible, And I think that that imperfection is a very sort of it's a kind of beautiful sickness within architecture. I mean, not dissimilar to your own open project. I'm conscious we might have questions from our wonderful audience, because you've been, there must be a fantastic reason you came to see this and the exhibition, and that you're here today. So I don't know if we have any questions from the audience or comments.
Break into this discussion. That's what I find fascinating. I'd like to hear the rest of you just carry on. I have a question in a slightly different register. It's sort of thinking about the historical moment of that you're there, and of course we all know that Wuhan was ground zero for COVID. And you are going in and out of Wuhan during that time, and I sort of expected to see something there, some remnants of that durational performance that was COVID in Wuhan in the village. And I sort of want you to. It's not there. I'd love to talk more about the scroll, and I have a lot of other comments. I'll have a chance to talk some more later today. But you've resisted the totality. You resist the plan, the urge to have that plan, to tie it off, and in a very commendable way. So anyway, but that's my question. It's about COVID.
The COVID it's a really interesting period in the village, actually, because actually a lot of them come back home, returning from the city, partially because there isn't much to do. It's all under lockdown. And also some of them just come back to find shelters themselves. And that actually is one of those moments where you can see most people there in the village while the rest of the time is empty. And they have this very odd, daily thing. Well, we have to do the test daily, the PRC test. in China. So that was a moment of gathering in the village where you see all of them just suddenly appear in that 1 hour. So all those grannies, aunties, you don't quite really see them. Usually they're just hiding their own cell. But then once they come for the test, it becomes a social gathering space for them. So that's a quite interesting thing. And then with the speaker, like hanging on a tree, just there for like 2 hours, repeating the same thing. Please come to somewhere to do blah, blah, blah. But we didn't talk because we thought it's a more sort of exceptional moment of the village rather than the ordinary sort of situation. So it's not captured, but it is an interesting time to stay there. And that kind of kept me trapped in the village as well. So I stayed 3 months in the village during the pandemic time because there's no way to really travel once you land. Yeah. Hope that answered your question.
It's like a really deep field work. I've got to hurry. It sure is.
Hi. First of all, congratulations on your the work that you've done, your presentation. In the start of your conversation, you spoke about how 80% of the middle generation, they migrate to the city to work, and the village therefore has grannies and toddlers. I wanted to understand what was your process of determining which problem to resolve, which is like, reintegrating the grannies and the aunties, or bringing back the middle generation into the communities. I want to understand, like, how did you determine one that you would want to solve one over the other?
I don't think you're solving anything.
I'm not solving it.
Or
We
address?
resolve neither. We resolve neither. We just choose to be with the people remain in the village. I guess that's kind of, I should explain, I looked at rural migrant workers first, the middle generation who work in the city first. And then as a second stage of that, I just start to wonder if all of them are here in the city, what happened in their home? So that brought us to the home village. And then we chose to stay with the home village. Yeah.
I think maybe also to ask you a question. Is it a problem? I mean, this is for both you and for you. Did you find a problem or did you find an unusual situation? Do you see the village as having a problem?
I think that's a very designer way of asking question.
it always-
Is there a problem? If there's no problem, I'm moving on to something else.
But it's interesting because that's the one thing we try and do educationally is to start to erode that binary. Because, then we become the great saviors that solve everyone's problems, although they never asked for us in the first place. But I'm curious, after all this time, whether you see it perhaps as a mode of difficulty or, because it's obviously kind of under the shadow of a problematic process, but the condition it creates is something else.
Yeah, I guess we recognize there is a condition. It's a issue, I guess, and then our design thinking becomes to say that if there's a different way to get to it, I suppose, that's because in a way, obviously, their situation is subject to systematic inequality, for sure, and there has been a huge amount of sociological work on that as well. But then again, to some point, it becomes a victim narrative that there are just vulnerable people waiting to be saved in that sense. And that's exactly the thing that we're trying to reject. But also, we also don't want to romanticize things. I hope that comes clear in our presentation. So at the end, it's really for us, it's a condition. It's a mix of agency, resistance, but also complicity in all of this that makes this condition happen, I suppose.
Is it therefore more, the question is around what kind of a knowledge is this that you've ended up creating? And maybe to continue the conversation with you, I guess, this uncomfortable question around should knowledge be useful and in what ways is knowledge useful,
I maybe have the question of also, is it possible not to sort of fetishize by making things beautiful? I mean, the photographs are beautiful, the film is beautiful, the drawing is beautiful. And not that one should make things less beautiful as a means of, they're no more authentic by being less beautiful. But there is a question of, the nature of observation when it takes on a visual aspect or a poetic aspect in writing. Does it somehow distort? I mean, this is maybe a question for the anthropologist.
It's a romanticization.
Yeah.
I think it didn't feel like you're othering, right? Throughout, I didn't get the sense that there you created this sort of distance. But there's the question about the romanticization of some indigenous authenticity, right? That somehow you're tapping into as somebody coming from the outside. But, and I think about those frontal portraits of the grannies, and they're delightful.
They dance really well.
I want to be a granny. What can I do to be a granny? That's my. I have to work on it, but so yeah. I mean, is the beauty a form of romanticization? I mean, is it a way of providing respect? Is it a way of showing them as people they want to be? Is it a matter of maybe showing their best side for themselves and their community? I mean, there's a feminist project in here as well, right? That's the other thing that's very clear throughout that no one's really sort of talked about. I don't know. I hardly feel qualified to start that conversation. But maybe that's part of is that part of the romanticization? I don't know. It's a problem. There's a whole sort of set of problems there. So it takes you back to it's always lurking there in anthropology, that somehow you believe you can get to that authenticity, that you have those X-ray specs that allow you to see that core thing that other outsiders can't do. I'm not saying you did that, but it would have been a dance. How do you play with that? How do you avoid that essentializing move that is so, well, it's the Achilles heel of all anthropology. There are others, but
I'm gonna jump in here, because I feel the poetic element here, what's being, I don't know what we call this, romanticized or poeticized, it's an attempt to register something of your relationship with the grannies and the aunties. So it comes back to this question of inventing kinship of some kind, where maybe your own emotional stuff in this project and how you present it is latent. And so if you were presenting this project in my PhD program, artistic research, I suppose the first question you'd be asked is, well, where are you in this? And we'd like this a little bit obvious. To me, as someone with a romantic sensibility, so I experienced this for the first time, and my take on it is it's a registration of your relationship with these women.
I think this is a much better response than what I had in mind. No, I think it's beautiful the way you said it. My answer was going to be that, because we're very conscious of the aesthetic dimension of it, and then we are doing that intentionally. One thing is for the grannies and aunties themselves, it's simply for the grannies because they refer to themselves as ugly and dirty. That's that answer. And then as for more general audience, is we are using this aesthetics to call for attention. That's
I perhaps am wrong in my role in that I tend to think more of film and of fiction and sometimes of food as the best ways of describing the relationship with cultures or the description of a condition. Because so often within fiction, I don't mean about building fictions through as a project, but so often a really good author will provide a multiple narrative that makes the situation that they are describing more ambiguous rather than more clear. And in many ways, a really talented designer does something quite similar, is they reveal incompatible and inconsistent aspects of a condition through the way in which they respond to it. And that's when things become really exceptional. And it's very, very different to the role of the anthropologist. Although in some ways, the myth of the casual observer or the unbiased objective observer is sort of its time, perhaps. I mean, not to say that it's anachronistic, but it has problems. So that question of who you are within that process and to what extent it is a truth or it bears any kind of authenticity. I think by making this also a speculative anthropological or ethnographic process opens up that possibility for an untruth, a productive untruth. And I'm interested to see where the project expands into with regard to, how do you create an explicit bias, an acknowledged bias within the depiction of the work, which is basically what you were saying, I think. I'm just saying it in a sloppier way. But are there any more questions? There's one over here.
I found this presentation very interesting, and there was one term that was used at some point about improvised kinships. And I was wondering, perhaps resonating from my own experience as a filmmaker who has worked in communities that are not necessarily my own, one of the things that I have found most difficult to navigate is class difference. So I was wondering if you could share with us some of your experience within this, setting up these or experiencing these improvised kinships, and how do you navigate class difference within these relationships?
Maybe I'll just share one story. So in the quite early on phase, so when the first granny we discovered together with Mengfan is Chen, so Cheng, Granny Chen. So she's a very, very different figure to other grannies. She's very expressive, talked a lot. So after seeing her a few times, she started to invent who I am, who we are. And every day when we see her, she calls me something different. So sometimes I'm her relative, sometimes like a distanced granddaughter. Sometimes it's just someone coming from the city to do project. So she play around different roles and plays it on me. So whenever she introduced me to many of her other friends, I always find myself with a different role, which I find that quite fascinating. And I think each day depends on her mood or what I wear. She just invented it. So I think that's a quite interesting way of interacting with them. And they always trying to find who I am. I think also for other grannies as well. It's just they are not that creative in terms of making this many different versions. So a lot of them say something and it becomes a fixed. But for this particular granny, it changes over time. So that's something It's something quite unexpected, and I really embrace it. I think this kind of, it's like a double improvisation between what I'm doing and what she's doing.
I wonder also that, the other, the tensions and the contradictions when it gets acute is in this scenario, the researcher who's part of the same nation state, so not as other as the white male researcher, but coming with institutional affordances of universities in the West. I think the way that that comes in, and sometimes it means that the compliance or the exercise of hospitality of such figures as the grannies and the aunties in the village towards those classified as almost like a granddaughter or something, depending on the day. But, the big unsaid here is with the backing of sort of, Western academic institution, and that we exercise hospitality by sort of giving them what we think they want or they need for the greater good, for educational learning. This, to me, is a very complicated, big dilemma. I have no way out of it, and it's so easy for the non-white researcher in the West to just benefit from this affordance as well. Too easy, way too easy. What happens? What do we do? Yeah.
I don't know if there are more questions, but I think we might be ready to break for lunch, in which case you can grab these three lovely people and ask them questions in a more informal manner. But thank you so much.
For lunch, we're inviting people to have lunch, if not to codes, actually on the foundation to experience it. That's it. Lunch? Okay, please.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.